Hello and welcome to this edition of Faculty Forum Online. This program, sponsored by the MIT Alumni Association, gives viewers a glimpse into a wide array of research being done here at MIT. On your screen you will see a box for submitting questions. Simply enter your first name or a screen name and your question and your geographic location and hit the submit button. That's all there is to it. Given the large number of viewers and the high volume of questions, I'm sure we won't get to all of them, but we'll do our best. I am Lou Alexander, MIT's Director of Alumni Education, and will serve as moderator today. In today's broadcast, we are focusing on big data and the idea of social physics. Addressing this is Alexander Pentland. Sandy is both an alumnus of and a professor at MIT, and his affiliations here and awards are too numerous to list. We would be here the whole half hour my reading them, so I will just say a few things. That he is the Toshiba Professor of Media Arts and Sciences, the Director of the Human Dynamics Lab, and the Director of the MIT Media Lab Entrepreneurship Program, in addition to co-leader of the World Economic Forum's Big Data and Private Data initiatives. Today's program will feature Sandy talking about some of the themes he raises in his latest book, Social Physics: How Ideas Turn into Actions. To get us started, Sandy, could you tell us more about what social physics is?
Sure.
And what some of the implications are?
Yeah. So this all started because this sense that we all have that we live in a world that is full of just crazy things. We're spinning out of control. We have financial crashes, the Arab Spring, we have political stalemate, and we don't really understand why any of this stuff is happening or what to do about it. And a lot of the problem is that we think about ourselves, our society, our institutions, using tools that are 2 centuries old. They come from the Enlightenment, they're markets and capitalism, they're classes and political coalitions. And those ideas are great and they've been useful, but they were forged in a more stately time when things moved more slowly, when it was actually just a small group of people that moved things forward. And now you have millions of people that join debates in minutes, and this sort of high dynamics that is causing this sense of things spinning out of control. So what struck me is that we need to move from a static way of thinking to a dynamic, and good engineering will tell you that you then need more data to be able to sample what's happening in between. And lo and behold, we have the era of big data. We have data from cell phones, from credit cards, from cars driving around. And suddenly, we can actually understand exactly what all the people are doing and how they're interacting in real time everywhere, potentially. And we have enough data to really begin to understand how society works. And so we've been able to do this to build a science of social physics, something that actually, statistically, is pretty good at predicting which things are going to be productive, which things are going to be creative, which things are going to crash and burn, when there's going to be a fad or a bubble. As some examples, we'd be able to use this for several companies to be able to improve their productivity rather dramatically, up to like 20%. We got a 10% improvement when we analyzed the transportation network of the Ivory Coast in Africa. We worked with a canton in Switzerland. We're able to get a 17% reduction in energy. And the key to this is knowing the flow of people and the flow of ideas as the people talk to each other. Because really, at the end of the day, it's ideas going between people that drives all these other systems. And of course, that's what social physics is about.
Well, it seems like there has been an explosion in the past few years of access to this kind of data, and I think we're all trying to get our heads around it. What are some ways in which big data can help, and what are some of the beneficial ways that it can help us?
Well, some of the things that are most important, I think, to pay attention to is we'd like to have our institutions be more, not just more productive, but more creative. And we've never really understood the sources of creativity. Is it like a few geniuses or something? And what we've been able to show is you can actually predict creative output from the flow of ideas among social networks within organizations. So we've been able to predict, for instance, patenting rate and GDP and things like that for cities around the world just by looking at their transportation and their social networks, which is pretty amazing. That means you can design cities to be creative. Another example is in health networks. So for instance, today we know that you're going to have pandemics that come along that will potentially kill hundreds of millions of people, and we have essentially no defense against that. The various sorts of things that we have don't work really well, but we've been able to show using this big data that we can actually see when individual people are getting sick. And if you can see that, then you can notify them to stay home, and you actually have what is potentially a realistic defense against a pandemic. Those are important things.
Yes, I was wondering how this would affect behavioral change, but that's a good example of that. Are there other ways, I wonder, other than pandemics, that we, maybe on smaller levels?
Well, the simple things, inside companies, we go in and we analyze people. We put these little name badges on them that keep track of who talks to who. We don't listen to what they say, just who talks to who. And what you find is often in companies that, sales doesn't talk to customer service, which doesn't cost to the development team. Whenever you see those disconnects, then the ideas don't flow very well. And of course, you get problems. And by measuring what actually happens around the coffee pot or in the hall, we've been able to change companies to be far more productive, far more creative in their output, just by making sure that the ideas flow around nicely. So there's a smaller sort of a thing. We have several spin-out companies that have come out of my group. One is Ginger.io. It does a check engine light. It has a little bit of software, it lives on your phone. Your doctor or hospital would ask you to do this, and it just shows when all of a sudden your life seems to be out of kilter, and maybe you should think about talking to your doctor. But that simple little intervention means that people that talk to a doctor just when they're getting sick and when you can do something, it's really transformative.
Right. As I think about it, maybe one of the elephants in the room is trust. And as we build this digital world in which we live, there is a question about how do we build trust in it, and especially given the recent revelations about government surveillance, it causes many of us to think twice about some of the information that is floating out there about us.
Yeah, well, so as I began to see what this new future of big data might look at, the very first thing that occurred to me had to do with privacy and trust. If you can't maintain safety, if you can't maintain trust, you end up with a terrible environment, a terrible culture that none of us would want to live in. And so I began a discussion at Davos between the chief regulators in the EU, ES, other places, and also the CEOs of many of the major companies. And what we were looking for was a win-win-win solution, something that would let the companies stay in business, let the governments do public goods like stopping pandemic diseases and increasing the productivity of the culture, and protect the citizens so that they could be part of this as well. And the solution that's been discussed and is now actually going into regulation, and which we're trying in real-world cities currently, is something that are called trust networks. And the idea is to be able to exchange information in ways that you as an individual control rather than some faceless entity. So we live in a world today where people spy on us all the time and then sell data about us out the back door, and that's got to stop. And the question is, from a technical and legal point of view, what do you do? And the best analogy is actually something that are called trust networks. The most familiar example is the SWIFT network, which transfers money between banks.
Yes.
So this is what the big guys have. If you have an infinite budget, you can hire all the lawyers in the world. What you get is the SWIFT network, because they handle $3 trillion a day. What turns out, though, is that we can build that for consumers. Nowadays, computers are fast enough that we can build the equivalent of that for people. And the keys to it are, first of all, you control data about you. You have a copy of data, and you share with me trusted answers, just like the SWIFT network does, and under a legal agreement that says, I won't sell that data further. And so that actually satisfies all of the comers, and you know, with the example of the SWIFT network, argues that we could actually get to a much more safe and human sort of world.
Interesting. And I wonder, I mean, I know aggression is built into our DNA, it appears to be. And I wonder if there's anything in this type of tool that would help to lessen the incidence of conflict, or is that beyond the
No,
the
it's
pale
very
for
much within the range. In fact, it's one of the great hopes of this sort of technology. And I'll take the example that we did in Ivory Coast. So we convinced the carrier Orange, depending on your accent, to release all of the call data that they had for this entire country. Now, the Ivory Coast, you might remember, is not only very poor, and in Africa, it also had a civil war not so long ago, a very violent civil war. And as a consequence, they had very little knowledge about, you know, what communities were in dire straits and what communities were doing well. They didn't really know where the ethnic boundaries were either that gave rise to this civil war. And it turns out you can look at call records in aggregate, something that can't be traced to any one person. And you can tell which communities are doing well and which ones aren't. You can tell what ethnic boundaries are. So what we're giving them is a transparency about their culture that can be used by the government to be able to try and heal wounds and get resources to the most needy. The next question might be, can you trust the government? But you know, if they don't know what they're doing, that's probably worse. So,
yes. Well, you know, let's take some questions from our viewers. David M., somewhere in cyberspace, asks, what is the future of all of us common folks having analytic access to big data? So
the discussions that I have at Davos and other places take this as a really sort of core thing, because it's complicated, right? How does the average citizen benefit from this? And the answer is that you need to think about this big data a little bit like you think about money. So you probably invest your money with a bank, put your money in a bank. The bank goes off and invests it. You don't even know where it goes. But there's enough oversight to that you can really trust that your money will be there when you need it. And so what there needs to be is a series of new companies or facilities that help us manage our data. That's not unrealistic. There's lots of startups that are beginning to do it. Interestingly, a lot of the big banks are interested in it. A lot of advocacy bodies, you know, like AARP for elders or church groups are interested in stepping in this because they see it as important that their members be able to manage, defend, and take advantage of this big data world. So that's the hope that people have.
Well, a similar question comes to us from Ken. He asks, how does a company get started with big data, and where does one start? Is there a good approach or methodology to employing big data?
Well, from my point of view, the key thing is to realize that, first of all, the term big data is something of a misnomer. It's not about its being big. It's about its being able to get insights that are really deep. So you can triangulate things much more than you ever could before. So it's really, big data is about being able to understand customers and employees better than ever before. That's the key understanding. And then the thing that you need to understand about what is happening in the regulatory space and the legal space is that the only way you can really legitimately get this sort of data is opt-in. You have to go to the customer. You have to tell them exactly what you're doing. You have to get opt-in and say, I would like to do this for you. Here's the value you'll get. Here's the value we'll get. Would you like to do this? And if they say yes, you're fine. You have to allow them to say no after a while, and then you have to get rid of the data that you've collected. You can't be selling it out of the back. And the Federal Trade Commission in this country, in the EU, the Justice Commission, are going to be increasingly firm with companies that try to take other solutions.
something that has occurred to me is being asked by Robert, could a dictator use social physics to control people?
And that's actually one of the major concerns is, we live in an environment that is a cooperative, fairly honest, fairly transparent environment. What would happen if you were in a country that had a strongly authoritative, authoritarian and not terribly pleasant government? And, the answer is yes, potentially. And then the next question is, what do you do to build bulwarks against that? And so the thing I talked about with the SWIFT network and trust networks, one of the key elements there is that individuals control data about themselves, which means it's actually harder for the dictators of the world to get at that without you knowing. Now, they can always get at that. They can send guys with guns to your house and steal your disk drive or whatever, But you want to make it hard enough that that's the solution they'd have to take rather than being able to do a few keystrokes on a keyboard and steal things. So distributing data, making the protection under individual control and heterogeneous is part of the solution. And you mentioned the NSA. So the NSA has actually been very useful in this because it provoked people to think seriously about this issue. And an amazing quote I found from the deputy director of the National Security Agency said, we made two big mistakes. Of course, he didn't say the mistake was lack of oversight. You think that's fine. But he said the two mistakes we made was we put all the data in one place and we gave some people access to all the data. And that's exactly right. If you put all the data in one spot, then what you've done is you've enabled not only spies, but people that want to overthrow the country. Okay, so even authoritarian governments ought to listen to that. If you put all the data in one spot under one guy's control, that's the guy that's going to overthrow the government. You really don't want to do that. So arguing for a much more distributed framework makes it tougher for people to abuse this sort of stuff. It's not impossible, but tougher. And I think our responsibility as technologists and as advocates is to push this sort of individual control that makes it hard for malevolent parties to do things that we're not aware of and are against our interests. But there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, because if you put that genie back in the bottle, then we don't have defenses against pandemics. Big data is the thing that's going to make global warming stop. Because if you can measure things, and you can measure people's behavior, and you can put the right incentives at exactly the right time, you can begin changing things big time. It's our lack of knowledge about behavior and lack of knowledge about the world that make global warming such a difficult problem. Big data gives us the potential to do that, but at the risk of this big brother society. And so the solution is not to get rid of the potential solution, but to make sure that the big brother society is very difficult to build.
Well, it really is massive, isn't it? I mean, think about the number of objects we all carry that are feeding into this pool of data. John asks a question about sampling. He wonders, how dense does the sampling have to be for a particular social physical methods to work? One extreme is a company where everyone can be directed to wear a sociometrics badge. Another is any large city. Do you have a handle on the relationship between sampling and predictability?
Well, sampling is like in any sort of system where you actually only need a small number of samples if you can distribute your samples correctly, so that you can get all the different types of people, all the different types of situations. As a practical matter, if you get up to 5 or 10%, you've got everything you need. Not everything, because you're going to miss small groups, but certainly by and large. And you can see that in today's traffic systems, which are in fact big data systems driven by cell phones. You can estimate the traffic jams and where people are going quite well from just a few percent of the people. And similar things happen in other domains. The main problem is things that change very quickly or have very small populations. And there, of course, you'd need much more dense sampling.
Following on John's question, Dan is asking a question that makes it more personal. Can you please detail a social big data project you are especially proud of? What were the big challenges with big data?
Well, so the one there's two that I'm most proud of at the moment. So one is this thing we did with Orange in the Ivory Coast, where we convinced them to release the data together with the University of Louvain. We set up this situation where we got research groups from 90 different universities around the world to look at the data, to be able to analyze it, and found we could get enormous savings in transportation costs and public health. We could give greater transparency into ethnic violence. That's an example of something where the data is actually something that it's aggregated. It's not as big as you might think, but that sort of continuous picture of human behavior and idea flow has enabled all these different things to happen. We did a similar thing with O2 in London just recently and found that you could do crime prediction in the future. So Minority Report made real. Raises ethical problems, right? If you can see the ethnic divisions, if you can predict when things are likely to happen, that's not something we're familiar with, but we're reaching these. The other thing that we've done, which I think is particularly good, is working with Telecom Italia and Telefonica and the city of Trento in Italy. We set up a living lab. So this is a city where we have people who are living in the future. They're living in a big data future. Now they know they're doing this. They've opted in. It's human subjects law and all that. But we're looking at what are the dangers, what are the rewards, what do people like, do they understand what's happening to them? And we're beginning with young families that have just had kids and elders as the two populations, and then hope to spread it to more people. And the goal is to learn, is this trust network idea something that's practical? Does it really work? Do people understand it? Does the big data actually give the rewards that we think it will, or is this all overblown hype? The only way you're really going to understand whether any of those things are true or false or what to do is to build it and try it. And so that's what we're doing.
Interestingly, here it comes, this is sort of a different take. David asks, first, what do you think of Evgeny Morozov's book, To Save Everything, Click Here, that argues against solutionism based on big data? So whether or not you're familiar with the book, I don't know, but certainly this thought about solutionism based on big data.
So I think what they're probably talking about is the following, is that when you have big data like this, you can use machine learning to find solutions to things, okay? However, in the era of big data, where things are so rich and so large, most of those solutions, the vast majority of them actually will be things that are false correlations, so they're misleading. They're inhuman in some way. They don't really be a world that we want to live in. And that's why I came up with the phrase social physics, because the key here is if you understand how humans naturally work, how society works, and remember we finally have the data to build quantitative predictive theories about how culture evolves, then you can use that to analyze big data in a way that says, from the human perspective, what is in this data that would allow me to achieve the values that I want to achieve? It's very different than just throwing machine learning at it. You're saying, I now understand something about people. I have this resource of data. How can I solve the human problems better using this new resource?
Yes.
This is sort of the basics of engineering since, forever in any domain. And the thing that's interesting is we finally have hope of having a quantitative understanding of human culture.
Yes. And it's interesting that you've mentioned SWIFT, and I think they've set into place various mechanisms for tracking flows of capital that might give clues as to some terrorist activities. And this leads into a question from Joe from Palm Beach. Have you done any work related on the prevention of terrorist attacks?
I tend not to get involved in things like that because there's obviously a lot of ethical questions. It's clearly high value. There was this organization called the NSA that does stuff like that. I think it's valuable. Some of my students have definitely done things like that. And that gets you to this sort of, another sort of ethical dimension. You don't want people spying on you, but at the same time, we know that there are bad actors out there, and how do we identify them, and take steps. And that's a big debate. It's an ethical debate. It's beyond sort of my pay grade. It's, it's one of those things that once you make it clear to people that these capabilities are out there, then there needs to be a discussion within the population about what are we going to do about this.
Yes, yes. Well, actually, Frank is asking the question, how can I opt out of big data, not just manage it? What if I don't want my big data to go to the banks, et cetera? Is there a way to
Well,
drop
that's
out?
one of the interesting things is that, you know, when we think about these trust networks, putting you more in control of your data means that you have the ability to opt out, at least to some degree. You know, you share data with your bank in order to be able to put money in there and get money out. So you're not, if you want to use a bank, you have to be able to share that data. With trust networks, you can specify to the bank under a legal contract that they can't resell the data. So it makes you safer. Same thing with cell phones, same thing with your employment. The fabric of human society is about sharing data. The part that's bad right now is that people then steal that data and do things with it. And so the idea of having a legal and technical framework that lets you control your data gives you some protection. If you want to go completely off-grid, then that means that you can't get services like banking, healthcare, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because they need to know who you are, they need to know your medical record in order to be able to deliver a good service. I think what will happen is, like in almost every area, is that over time, the risks and rewards of this will become clear, and people will decide either to be very conservative about sharing, or there'll be enough trust that they'll feel more comfortable about sharing. Yes. And that will change also over time as the bad guys get new tools and the good guys offer new benefits. So you should think of data as a new asset that everybody has, like having money or having land. And we're just beginning to understand what you can do with that asset to make your life better, and what you can do with the public, with government, to make the society better. I mean, just to make a very sort of poignant example, let's imagine there was a pandemic coming through, and we would expect perhaps 50 million Americans to die and 200 million people to die around the world. Now, do you think the government would be within its rights to ask for your data, to be able to identify if you were a carrier right this instant? Most people would say yes, but yet that's one of the most invasive things you can imagine.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
So there are extreme circumstances, and we need to think about the entire range of things. Personally, I believe that if you can control your data and where it goes, then you can begin to manage it in a way where it becomes much less of an issue.
Sandy, we're just coming down to the end of this, so we have time for one more question. I would love to pick your brain for the next half hour, but we can't. Pavitra asks, and this is about one of your other hats, could you share more on the World Economic Forum's Big Data Initiative?
Well, the initiative is around, what the World Forum does, first of all, is provoke a discussion between world leaders in government, industry, and NGOs. So there's all the people from, you know, the various advocacy groups there too, in an attempt to get people to understand the other people's point of view and see if there's commonality. It doesn't actually do anything except convene a discussion. So around big data, the question is, what about the privacy? What about government abuse? How do you do this? What does it mean? What are the things you need to invest in to take advantage of it? A major question are what are the public goods, and particularly in the developing world? And some of the interesting things are, for instance, this thing we did in the Ivory Coast, where you take a very poor country that's just recovering from a civil war, and you show that you can generate enormous public goods in that country by use of these sorts of data. And so, you know, that's an example that says, well, okay, there actually are some public goods that seem very likely to accrue from having this. So now we need to think about a way to allow this to happen, where the companies are happy to participate, the governments know what to do, the citizenry feels comfortable. And that's the Big Data Initiative, is how do you get to win-win-win?
Sandy, thank you so much. We definitely are at the end of our time slot here. You have given us much to think about. And for those who want to continue the discussion, tune into our blog, Slice of Life. You'll see the URL on the slide following this. So please join us again in November for the next noontime broadcast. And we'd also like to say that beginning October 23rd, we will have a 3-part evening edition of this, looking on the Public Service Center at MIT. Stay tuned for information coming soon about that. Again, Sandy, thanks so much for the ideas you've given us. And this concludes our snapshot of MIT Today, to October the 2nd, 2013.